What's up, folks? Welcome back to Tactical Tortoise. My name is Trevi, and there's been a lot of discourse recently about exactly how defensively oriented 10th edition Warhammer 40k is. And now we have a lot of the datasheets and weapon profiles spoiled, we can really talk about it. So let's answer the question today, exactly how tanky is 10th edition Warhammer 40k gonna be? In today's video, what we're gonna be doing is breaking down a bunch of the defensive profiles, specifically for heavier units like monsters and vehicles that we've seen so far. I'm gonna be looking at the standard Rhino, a Redemptor Dreadnought, a Hekaton Landfortress, Bellicor, and a Hekaton Knight. We're then going to compare them to a bunch of anti-armor or mid-range weapons, including meltas or multi-meltas, las cannons, heavy bolters, and power fists, and comparing their 9th edition matchup with those weapons to how they rock up in 10th edition. For each of these categories, I'm going to be talking about a single weapon activation. We are going to be talking about power fists, and I'm going to talk about a single power fist attack, so you can expect that a model with 3 or 4 attacks would be 3 or 4 times as much damage. For meltas specifically, I'm going to consider them to be an optimal range, so they're going to get the Melta damage bonus, and they are just a normal Melta profile, so it's one shot. If you want to consider it with a multi-Melta, you would just multiply it by 2, because they are a Melta that cheats 2 times. I'm not including any sub-faction or detachment rules in this analysis, so things like the Hekaton Knight will not get the 6 sub damage ignore that it would from the Knight detachment. We're also going to be assuming that everything has a base weapon scale, ballistic scale of 3, and isn't really suffering any hit penalties that aren't imposed by the weapon themselves. The exception to this would be the 9th edition Power Fist that did impose itself a -1 to hit penalty that was just always there. The other thing to consider is that vehicles and monsters now get cover in 10th edition a lot more easily than they did in 9th. Because in 9th edition, vehicles and monsters basically couldn't get cover from terrain outside dense cover occasionally, unless they were granted it specifically by a special effect. But in 10th edition, vehicles and monsters are basically very often going to have cover. So we're going to be considering their profile both with the +1 save and without it. Now, I'm borderline illiterate and terrible at math, so this video took a little while to get through. So if you enjoy it, please drop a like on the video and maybe subscribe to the channel if you like my style of Warhammer 40k content. And I'm also going to be using some graphics that I recently had commissioned in an effort to slowly but surely increase the production value of the channel. So if you like those, let me know down in the comment section below. Starting with the smaller units, let's talk about the Rhino. In its 9th edition incarnation, this thing was a T7, 3+ save, 10 wound vehicle, but moving into 9th edition, it is becoming T9. This is a pretty average profile, so the Rhino is a good equivalent for a lot of other similar vehicles. Things like Chimeras and now Storm Speeders are basically going to be the same level of survivability as a Rhino, so it's kind of a good stand-in for a lot of medium weight vehicles. So moving into the numbers here, our hapless Rhino would have been wounded on 3s in 9th edition, thanks to that strength and toughness characteristic. Comparison to the 8th edition Melta, but in 10th edition is now wounded on 4s, given its newfound increase in toughness. Without the +1 save, their damage survivability versus a Melta is relatively similar. It takes a single additional Melta shot to kill them. In 10th edition, if they are in cover, it actually takes an additional one. So they're going to be about 30 to 50% more survivable to Melta attacks. Las cannons, however, with their newfound additional damage, doing d6 +1 damage, have an easier time damaging them. So their survivability when in cover is going to be relatively the same, because the +1 save will largely cancel out the +1 damage, but if they're out in the open, they're actually going to get easier to kill. And this really showcases las cannons as one of the game's premier anti-tank weapons. Heavy bolters similarly in 10th edition have had kind of a glow up. Because of their new sustained hits effect, they'll actually convert on average a lot more hits than they would previously in 9th edition, which makes them better in almost every situation. And once we start talking about the -1 damage profiles, we're going to see heavy bolters really improving. The downside of the heavy bolter is its low AP value, so it is disproportionately affected by cover. So as we can see, cover is about a 50% survivability increase to the Rhino from the 10th edition heavy bolter. This required 15 heavy bolter activations to kill a Rhino in 9th edition, moving down to 12 in 10th edition, but up to 18 if that Rhino is benefiting from cover. Last but not least, we have the Power Fist profile. In 9th edition, these were higher AP, AP 3, at strength 8, 2 damage, but suffered -1 to hit. In 10th edition, they lose that -1 to hit, so they're hitting on whatever whatever their base weapon skill is. In this case, we considered it to be a 3+. They're still at strength 8, but the comparative toughness value of other units has made that a lot worse, and lower AP. This made them do a little bit more than half a damage per attack in 9th edition, but in 10th, moving down to only a third. A Redemptor Dreadnought has a very similar profile. In 9th edition, they also had that damage reduction. They had more wounds, but they also had a worse saving throw. Now they have toughness 10 with a 2+ save. In 9th edition, this made them particularly susceptible to Melta weapons, since the -1 damage wasn't too effective if you were a high base damage, so 7 Melta conversions would kill Redemptor. Now that higher toughness makes it much tougher for those Meltas to get through, taking 12 or 15 to kill a Redemptor, depending on whether they're in cover or not. The las cannon, similar to what we've seen before, however, is actually much more effective. In 9th edition, it took 14 converted las cannon hits to kill a Redemptor, and in 10th edition now only takes 9, but moves closer to being roughly equivalent if the Redemptor is benefiting from cover. Now, the heavy bolter profile is one that is gonna be a real surprise here, because these heavy bolters got absolutely neutered by -1 damage effects, and it was one of the reasons that you actually didn't see 2 damage weapons in the metagame that often, outside some very specific situations. Space Marines played grav cannons and the Volkite Contemptor, but those were largely because they synergized well with Space Marine profiles. Heavy bolters, however, were not really played. And one of the reasons for that is that this high save damage reducing profile made it super difficult for heavy bolters to find purchase. But in 10th edition, despite the fact that they now wound on 6s rather than 5s, the addition of sustained hits and lack of damage reduction makes them about 20% better. It's taking only 40 heavy bolter activations to down a Redemptor in 9th edition. In 10th, however, the higher toughness value of the Redemptor is really pulling through for it, taking 43 conversions or 86 if it's in cover. In cover will basically ignore all of the AP that a heavy bolter has. Last but certainly not least, we see something similar tap into the Power Fist. So while the Power Fist in 9th edition had much better stats at punching through, it was -1 to hit, but the higher AP was better against the higher saving characteristic, and their big strength made it so that they wounded on 3s. The problem was that their incoming damage was basically being halved, thanks to that damage reduction effect. In 10th edition, that's no longer the case. And the effective +1 to hit on the Power Fist, now that they don't have a hit penalty baked in, mostly makes up for their lack in strength to punch through the high toughness characteristic. So they're actually going to be almost twice as effective against these units that used to reduce damage. In 9th edition, it took a staggering 93 converted Power Fist attacks to down a Redemptor Dreadnought because of their high wound count and damage reduction. But in 10th edition, it only takes 55. So these 2 damage weapons are about twice as effective against the Redemptor Dreadnought as they were previously. The Hekaton Landfortress is our next one. In 9th edition, these things had a 2+ save with a built-in -1 AP, thanks to their Void Armor. They also couldn't be rerolled against, which they now can be, which is a pretty big loss of survivability. The Hekaton is going to be a pretty good analog for things like Land Raiders once we get all of their assembled data sheets. In 9th edition, these guys being wounded on 4s from Melta weapons and the high AP of Melta weapons not being quite as impacted by that -1 AP effect made them relatively effective against the Land Fortress. It still took 13 Meltas on average to kill a Hekaton Land Fortress, about double what it took to kill a Redemptor Dreadnought. That is a much better number than the 16 it takes to kill them with their 10th E profile. And that's even including the Void Armor in the arithmetic there. If the Hekaton Land Fortress is benefiting from cover, which it probably will be quite a bit, that number goes up to a massive 20 Melta guns to kill one. Like we've seen with the other profiles, the las cannon has a bit more luck. In 9th edition, these things didn't do very much to the Hekaton Land Fortress because they had a lower AP value, so they were comparatively more heavily impacted by Void Armor, and they did less damage than they do in 10th edition. However, in 10th edition, not having to deal with that Void Armor and doing additional damage, plus being one of the few weapon strengths that actually wounds them on 4s, means it only takes 16 to kill a Land Fortress. In fact, actually almost exactly what it takes. Once they're in cover, however, the lower AP value of the las cannon does start to hurt quite a bit. It now takes 22 las cannons, which each las cannon averaging about 0.75 of a damage. The Land Fortress with a high toughness and high saving characteristic is the bane of the Heavy Bolter. While the Heavy Bolter did get a lot of benefits in 10th edition, they don't have to worry about Void Armor when not dealing with cover anymore. So they went from taking 73 Heavy Bolter activations to down a Land Fortress to only taking a measly 57 in 10th edition, because now they have that sustained hits and they're actually reducing the saving characteristic of the Land Fortress. Once that Land Fortress goes into cover, the additional save characteristic cuts in half the expected failed saves against the Heavy Bolter, moving that number to a massive 114. When it comes to Power Fist, however, these guys have become a lot more resilient. The new low AP value of the Power Fist means it's not very good against 2+ saves, and their lower strength compared to the Hekaton Landfortresses' higher toughness value means it now takes 72 Power Fist attacks to down 1 versus the 64 in 9th edition. Not a huge increase in survivability, but it is definitely still worth talking about. Now, we wanted to talk about one of the big daddy demons of the 9th edition metagame, so let's dive into Be'lakor. And honestly, this guy is a pretty wild profile. I don't know if I had entirely internalized how difficult he was to kill in 9th edition, but he's certainly much different in 10th edition. Now, obviously, Be'lakor comes with a caveat that there are going to be significant portions of the game where he cannot be attacked by many of these weapons because he's turning on his no ranged attacks outside 18 inches aura. For the first couple turns of the game, he's basically not going to be receiving any damage. So while once he's being fired at, he actually takes a lot more damage in 10th edition than he ever did in 9th edition. The difference there is that you're going to lose 1 to 2 turns of actually shooting at him over the course of the game. Comparatively, that makes him about as survivable as he was previously, but it does mean that your opponent isn't dumping ranged attacks into the hole that Be'lakor creates in your damage output. In 9th edition, Be'lakor had a massive number of defensive buffs on him. He was -1 to be hit, -1 to be wounded permanently, couldn't be rerolled against, and had -1 damage against ranged attacks. That made all the ranged weapons we're talking about today much worse at killing him. So the Melta weapons, for example, took 36 converted attacks to kill Be'lakor, their high EP value entirely ignored by his demonic invulnerability. Because Melta weapons had a high strength versus his toughness value in 9th edition, he actually is comparatively slightly tougher to wound now in 10th edition, but he's not reducing their damage anymore, and he has less wounds overall, going down to 18 from 20, so he's about as even to kill from a Melta gun. It took 36 Melta guns to kill him in 9th edition, moving up to 39 in 10th. Las Cannons, however, are having an absolute field day with this guy. They're doing more damage, they're wounding more often, and while their hit characteristic hasn't really changed, otherwise they've just gotten strictly better against him. They're basically +2 damage, because they're ignoring the -1, and they have their own +1. It took a massive 64 Las Cannon shots to kill him in 9th edition, but that has quadrupled in effectiveness in 10th, now taking only 18. It definitely makes Las Cannons incredibly good at downing this guy. Heavy Bolters, similarly, are now no longer being affected by his -1 damage ability, and because they now have sustained hits, making their hits slightly more consistent anyway, they actually wound him again about 3 times as often, taking only 54 Heavy Bolter activations to kill Be'lakor, rather than the 153 that it took in 9th edition. Last but certainly not least, the Power Fist is actually basically the same. It wasn't affected by a lot of his ranged damage modifiers, and it also wasn't affected by his -1 to hit, given that it had its own built-in -1 to hit back in the day. So while his higher toughness value does make it a little bit tougher for the Power Fist to wound him, that means that it only takes 82 Power Fist attacks to kill Be'lakor, rather than the 80 it took in 9th. Last, but certainly not least, we have the big boys of the 41st millennium, the Knights, and we talk about the Questoris Knight. Now, in 9th edition, these guys were T8 with 24 wounds, a 3+ save, and a built-in 5+ invulnerable save. In 10th edition, they moved up to toughness 12, which is a much higher comparative toughness value, but lost 2 wounds. Again, we're not talking about any of the subfaction benefits for these guys, so there was a lot of healing and damage ignore mechanics built into their subfactions, and those are kind of retained in their detachment abilities, so we're just going to ignore those entirely. Melta weapons were particularly effective against these T8 profiles in 9th edition. It took 20 Meltas to down 1 in the previous edition, whereas in 10th edition, now they're wounding on 5s, but still butting up against their invulnerable save, are going to take 27. In that case, the high AP value of the Meltas, and we'll see the same for Las Cannons, is not affected by the cover that Knights can now apparently get from ruins and stuff, which is kind of nice for them. Las Cannons are almost identically efficient, however. They wounded on 3s previously, now wounding on 4s, but they did less damage than they do now. That said, this is the one instance where we see Heavy Bolters significantly less effective than they were previously. Previously, it took 36 Heavy Bolter activations to dump into a Knight to down them. Now it takes a massive 52. This is largely because of the higher toughness characteristic of those Knights, basically making those Heavy Bolters -1 to wound. Once the Knight benefits from cover as well, this gets even worse, going up to 79 converted Heavy Bolter activations to kill, basically twice as survivable as they were in the last edition. Last but certainly not least, the Power Fist. And again, this is relatively similar. The higher toughness value kind of cancels out the -1 to hit effect that the Power Fist granted in 9th edition, and the downside here for the fist is going to be its lower AP value, which makes it about 40% less effective into these high toughness profiles. Previously, it took 57 tax to kill a Crastorus Knight, now it takes 73. Now, some interesting takeaways from this mathematical exercise. I think it is interesting how hard they're pushing las cannons as the premier anti-tank. Where melta weapons are pretty good against the lighter vehicles, they're not very good against the high toughness stuff that they need 5s to wound. If you're winning on worse than a 4, you might as well look to a las cannon to deal your anti-tank damage anyway. It's a longer range and more consistent. Heavy bolters and these 2 damage weapons have wildly benefited from the lack of -1 damage that we now see in the new edition. So I do think that heavy bolters and heavy bolter equivalents 2 damage mid-strength weapons are going to be a pretty decent profile. The downside of the heavy bolter is that low AP, and given the fact that a lot of things will be a high saving throw thanks to cover, the heavy bolter will have a lot more trouble punching through high armor saves. So we're hoping that we can get maybe a couple extra points of AP in there. I know that Space Marines can source ignore cover and 1 AP from Devastator Doctrine, so maybe we can see a heavy bolter equivalent be the Space Marine weapon of choice. And especially with their Oaths of Moment giving lots of rerolls, high volume weapons are going to really benefit from that. In my opinion, the big loser here are Power Fists. You can basically expect the same amount of damage from Power Fists into most targets. They're going to be wounding most heavy vehicles on 5s, they're going to force most of them into a 4+ or 5+ save, and they're going to hit basically everything on 3s because they don't impose their own -1 to hit anymore. The downside is that not only is melee harder to get into, but they also do comparatively less damage against sort of standard vehicle profiles than they did previously. So I think the primary use case of Power Fist is going to be to punch enemy heavy infantry, where their high strength and mid AP is actually going to be relevant, versus maybe Thunder Hammers converting devastating wounds into these heavier vehicles. I'm not entirely sure what weapon combinations we can see that will make these units very effective against vehicles in melee. We can get +1 to wound on the charge for things like Space Marines, so those Power Fists can circumvent their comparatively lower strength characteristic, but it might need some combo play in order to get these big vehicles killed in melee. It doesn't seem like it's going to be done very efficiently given the profiles that we know right now. So overall, can we answer the question how tanky 10th edition is going to be? And I think the answer is a lot tankier than 10th edition, but not in quite the same linear way that I would have expected. It looks like a lot of the balance of anti-tank weapons in the game has been reoriented. Melta weapons are a little bit less effective, las cannons are a little bit more consistent, and those heavy bolters are much more smoothed over. Not to mention the fact that Power Fists and those 2 damage melee weapon profiles are basically doing the same expected damage against almost anything that you punch. This makes it so specific profile matchups aren't quite as important as they were in 9th edition. In 9th edition, if you had a mass 2 damage mid-AP army versus something like a Screamer Killer, you were doing nothing against them. Whereas in 10th edition, you can expect a reasonably similar output against most enemies. The thing you have to watch out for are those high saving values in cover. That's where low AP weapons are really going to struggle, but if you can force your opponent to break cover and cross the mid-board of the table to actually fight you, you're actually going to be able to do pretty well. And with that, that's all the takeaways I have for you today. Let me know down in the comment section if there are any other weapons that you think would be effective against these specific profiles, and how you feel about the resilience of units in 10th edition. Big thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks as well to everybody who supports the channel either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All you people are great and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.